working. Tennis. Of where does the biblical story of the Exodus fit into Egyptian history? And that has been a mystery and kind of a problem. And so he really did a tremendous amount of research on there for most of his life. And he wrote this little book, and so I'm out of the book. And we are up to, now we're, it's not going. Here we go. A Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, part 6. So far we have looked at dates and spans of time. The biblical span of time for the time that the Israelites were in Egypt, about 110, it was 210 years. If you count the time that Joseph arrived, then you add another 22 years, that would make it 232 years from the time that Joseph arrived in Egypt until the Exodus. We looked at that and saw how you detect those things. There are note pages that are back on the back table back there, and some back pages as well, but I think that they were picked over pretty clean this morning. We will make more for next week. Make a few more. I don't like to have just tons of those things left over, from year to year, but I file this away and I might use it again and so if you need one, be sure you pick one up next week. But we also talked about Joseph and the 12th dynasty of Egyptian history. Where would you find the events that fit in with the story of Joseph and the story of the Israelites and the story of Moses? And where do you find all of that in any particular dynasty? And you find it in the 12th dynasty. We also had a lesson about Joseph and the first Pharaoh, Sesostris. I have Sesos, that's just an abbreviation. Sesostris the first would have had a lot of interaction with Joseph. That was the time that there was a famine. There was a famine in the land of Egypt, historically speaking, during the time of Sesostris I. Sesostris I and his vizier, which would be his chief advisor, his closest companion and advisor, they, in Egyptian history, they gathered a whole lot of grain and put it into storage, and then you find in the history of Sesostris I the distribution of that grain back out after a famine to foreigners and local domestic people alike. And Sesostris I ended up being just an absolute billionaire after we knew that. He owned all the land, he owned all the people, owned all the cattle, everything. He owned that. In the Egyptian history under the reign of Sesostris the first. And then we talked about the Israelites being in Egypt, free foreigners in the land, especially in the time of Sesostris II. You start having documentation of many foreign workers that were free foreign workers in Egypt during that period of time. So we've been looking at all of that. So if you have your notes, I kind of go by them to try to keep them rambling around and taking too much time. The documents contemporary with Sesostris II are the first to show a large number of free workers from Canaan serving beside Egyptian laborers. Sesostris II would have been the last Egyptian pharaoh to welcome Canaanite immigrants into the land. And they were welcome. Foreigners were working. They had jobs. They didn't have taskmasters. They weren't slaves. They weren't conquered. They were just free people that were living there. But all of that ended after Sesostris II. The next pharaoh, Sesostris III, became suspicious and fearful. And I'm talking about in Egyptian history. Now we know that that's the case in the Bible, but in Egyptian history, this pharaoh just was weird. He just kind of weirded out. He just was so fearful and suspicious of the foreigners in the land that he kind of became a very mean and cruel guy. So we'll look at what Egyptian history says about that. But first, let's come in here. Look at again, Troy. Let's get Exodus chapter 1, verses 6 through 11. We'll get that up there. Are you there? Exodus chapter 1. Here, ready? Verses 6 through 11. There. So all his brothers are gone. Yeah, he's gone. The whole generation of those who came into Egypt died. But the sons of Israel were fruitful. The Israelites were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them, the land of Goshen, where they lived. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply. And in the event of war, they also join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us and depart from the land. So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor. And they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. Okay, so there's what happens next in the Bible story. In contrast to the reigns of first, Sesostris the first, Moslemite the second, and Sesostris the second. The reign of Sesostris the third, the yellow guy there, is characterized, I would say, more than anything, by fear. He just was a paranoid guy. Some rulers are like that. They just think, everybody's plotting against me. Everything is against me. Now, Sesostris the first ended up owning everything, and the people loved him, and they worked for him. Free. They became slaves to him, but they didn't have to have anybody forcing them. They thought that he was God because he saved them from this horrible family. And it was his ingenuity, they thought, that had done that. And so it was a time of prosperity that at the end of Sesostris I that then carried over into Amenemhet II and Sesostris II. Great prosperity, great freedom. Everybody had jobs. Everybody was working. Everybody was happy. There were the Egyptians as well as the foreigners alike were all in happy harmony with one another. But Sesostris III began a process that was a downward spiral all the way to the last very short reign of the last male pharaoh of the dynasty, who was Amenemhet IV. And it was characterized by cruelty, by domination, injustice, pride, greed, hostility, disrespect for other people. All of this because of the fearfulness that this guy had. Sesostris III had a great fear even of his own people. As you can see, the Cambridge Ancient History records this decree by the Pharaoh. This is Sesostris III sends out this decree. So here you are living in a prosperous land, and all of a sudden, here's the memo that comes. Egyptians, says, all men, all people, all folk, all males, all eunuchs, all women, and all officials who may rebel, who may plot, who may fight, who may talk of fighting, who may talk of rebelling, and every rebel who talks of rebelling in this entire land shall die. So all of a sudden, this is what you get. This is an actual decree that was sent out by him, as recorded by historians. And the people are like, wow, who's thinking about doing this? Who's even doing it? I mean, you can't talk about it. You can't do it. You can't even think about it. You better not even think about rebelling against me, or else you're going to die. Now, in Egypt, what we would call a state was called a nome. And what we would call a governor, they called a nomarch, because he was the ark, or the ruler of the nome. So during the time of Sesostris I, Joseph gave this idea, hey, let's delegate things. Let's organize ourselves. Give other people some power and responsibility. So they had all these nomarchs and all of these nomes around the country. And in the time of Sesostris III, all of the governors, or the nomarchs, were just removed from their positions, according to history. He just comes in there and said, okay, you're not in charge anymore. And every nome was placed under the direct control of, who do you think? Pharaoh himself. Can you imagine the responsibility that would be? I mean, the actual stress that you would be under if suddenly what other people were all doing, now you're going to control all that yourself, because you don't trust them. You don't trust anybody. Faithful Egyptian officials who had served under these other pharaohs and had done a good job. They were men of integrity. They were competent in what they did, and everything was prosperous, were suddenly just stripped of their wealth and stripped of their position. And now the Pharaoh is going to take over everything. Okay, so here is a lament, a written lament by a guy by the name of Ankud, who was the son of Sini, who was the priest at Heliopolis. And so he wrote this. It's been preserved. Archaeologists have found this. He said, I meditate on what has happened. The events that occur throughout the land, changes take place. It's not like last year. One year is more irksome than the other. Order is cast out. Chaos is in the council hall. The whole land is in great distress. Nobody's free from crime. Hearts are greedy. He who gave orders now keeps orders. And the hearts of both submit to the Pharaoh. The land is in turmoil. There is mourning everywhere. Towns, districts are grieving. All alike are burdened by wrongs. Just like that, a new guy comes in. A new Pharaoh, a new administration takes over. And all this virtue and benevolence that had been rewarded by the pharaohs of Joseph's day, positions of authority, responsibility that had been delegated, are suddenly no more. Natural citizens and foreigners alike who had been happy in their jobs and everything was working in peace and harmony. Suddenly it just ends. Harshness and cruelty begins to be the rule of the day under Sesostris III. Williams Hayes made this observation of Sesostris' appearance. He said, especially searching are the portraits of Sesostris III, whose grim, disdainful face deeply lined with fatigue and disillusionment, is preserved to us on a score of statues. Now, this is from the Cambridge Ancient History. Hayes, he wasn't trying to prove anything. He hadn't read Ted Stewart's book. He wasn't in collaboration with it. He wasn't even thinking about the Israelite situation. He was just thinking about Sesostris and what they were uncovering about him in the 12th dynasty. And they find all this stuff about how cruel he is, and how suspicious he is, and how forlorn he often looked in the portraits of him. So there's a lot of bad stuff that's going on right there in his own country. But Sesostris III also feared the descendants of Anak, who dwelt in Canaan. You ever heard of them, the Anakim? Read about them later on in Exodus. So he didn't like those guys, and so he wrote some papers that were called the execration texts, in which he curses the three leaders of the Anakim. So here you got pharaohs over here in Egypt, and over here in Canaan you've got this rising superpower of people that are called the Anakim. And so he's fearful of them. All right, so you kind of get the lay of the land of what's going on during this time. Everyone feared these guys, though. It wasn't just him. They were just very fierce warriors and gigantic people. The Assyrians called them the great gods of the earth, according to Lucanville in his ancient records of Assyria. So from down to Egypt, all the way to the top of the projector, way in the corner up there, the Assyrians, everybody doesn't like these guys. They're all afraid of them. The Israelites' spies described them in Numbers chapter 13 when they came back from spying out the land, which would have been about 100 years after the time we're studying right now. The Anakim are coming into power here in the 12th dynasty of Egypt. But about 80 to 100 years later, you're going to find the Israelites coming up there. They go spy out the land, and they said the people are strong. The cities are fortified. And he says the descendants of Anak are there in verse 28. I didn't put all of it there, but they said the descendants of Anak are there. We saw the Nephilim, verse 33. The word Nephilim means giants. We saw the giants. We became as grasshoppers in our own sight. So we were in their sight. These Canaanite clans were fierce, aggressive, extremely wicked during this time. Archaeologists tell us that large, high-walled cities were constructed all over Canaan during the time of the 12th Egyptian dynasty. When later, 80 to 100 years later or so, whenever Moses is leading the people up to take possession of this land, here's what Moses said to them. He said, you're now about to cross the Jordan to go in and dispossess nations greater and stronger than you, with large cities that have walls up to the sky. But these walls were constructed during the time of Sesostris III. And the rise of the Anakim was going on during this time. Now, it wasn't this way in the days of Abraham. 300 years before, when Abraham came into the land of Canaan, and he sometimes lived near Hebron. And Hebron would be right about where the eye of Anakim is. Maybe the K. Somewhere between the K and the I of the Anakim is where Hebron would be. And Abraham came in there 300 years before. And it wasn't the Anakim that were ruling, it was the Hittites. The Hittites had control of Hebron. According to Genesis 13, Genesis 23, Genesis 35, 36, 37, all tell about this period of time, and it was the Hittites. However, in Moses' day, the place, Hebron, was called Kiriath Arba, which means the city of Arba. Genesis 23, Genesis 35, Joshua 14, that's all in the notes there. It's called the city of Arba. Arba was the father of Anak. And Anak was the patriarch of the Anakim, the giant, fierce Canaanite clan. So a lot changed from the time of Abraham until the time of Sesostris III in the 12th dynasty of Egypt. During the time that Israel was the land of Goshen, multiplying and becoming a great, vast people, the Canaanites were evolving into a people of fortified cities and giant, savage warriors. Okay? There. Kind of get the picture of what was going on, historically speaking. Sesostris III feared the inhabitants of Canaan and Syria, and so he built fortresses in the eastern delta of Egypt to protect against invasion from the Anakim. Fortresses he built along his eastern border. He also put a stop to any immigration coming in from Canaan. No more immigrants. We're not allowing anybody in here anymore. He distrusted all foreigners. And he commissioned his army to enslave the ones who had taken over the land of Goshen. So let's take a look at that. That period of time where he's taking over and making slaves of all the people foreigners that lived in Goshen, and preparing these fortresses against the Anakim. Let's look at that period of time. Sesostris III ordered the construction of the store cities of Pithom and Ramesses. They had not existed up until this time. He ordered their construction. Now, there had been some stuff there, but they were not store cities that were built up to hold a lot of supplies and stuff like he built it up. I think we ought to talk a little bit about, first of all, Python is misspelled on that map. I didn't make this map. I just stole it off of Google. There were many maps like this, but this was the best one that had more wide open spaces to put stuff. I mean, some of them are too busy. But this one was just right, except that it misspelled. They have Python. That's a snake, I think. So later on in the 19th dynasty, which one are we studying right now? The 12th. We're looking at the 12th dynasty. In the 19th dynasty is whenever Ramses II was the great pharaoh. That was a pretty long time, like 300 years or so later. And because he built his capital there at this spot, and because of the extensive and elaborate construction that he did on this site, many believe that the city or the town of Ramesses did not exist until the 19th dynasty. However, one of the leading archaeologists of Israel, Amahai Mazar, insists that finds of Canaanite origin were detected at Tel El Daba. Tel El Daba is what they now call what was the site of ancient Ramesses. Canaanite remains, or the evidence of Canaanite existence in Tel El Daba has been discovered in contexts that date back to the latter part of the 12th dynasty in Egypt. Now, if you have looked at the video that we have, that's what that video is talking about. It's talking about the discoveries that were done at Tel El Daba and around in that area. And so this book came out in 1999. The video came out last year. And so the video comes to the same conclusions, although it's not nearly as substantiated as this book. This book has way more stuff that he's dug out than the video, but the video comes to the same conclusion. The Israelites were there. They were there. There's evidence for them being there. But the timetable's all off. The Egyptian timetable is off for some reason. He gives some ways to correct that in the video. But nevertheless, the Atlas of Ancient Egypt shows at this spot here, Ramesses, Tel El Daba, they have discovered a columned chapel of Amenemhet I. Amenemhet I, way back, the first pharaoh of the 12th dynasty, he was doing stuff right here at this spot. He was building chapels there, doing construction. There is evidence of what Sesostris III was doing there during that time in that location. Also found at Tel El Daba was a statue of Queen Neferuso, the mother of Amenemhet IV. Amenemhet IV is going to be the last pharaoh of the 12th dynasty. And his mother, some artifacts dating back to his mother are found at this spot. It was a very well-used area by the people in the 12th dynasty. Scholars of Egyptian archaeology all agree that the remains of Pithom are located in the region of Goshen, not far from Tel El Daba, not far from the place where Ramesses is. Although there are a number of things that they've discovered around in that area, and they are divided as to which one might be Pithom, but they believe it's one of the ones that they've looked at. The name Pithom is from the Egyptian name Patum, which means Atum Ra. It is a name in honor of the Egyptian god Atum Ra. Pithom, we would call it. Pithom and Ramesses. So we're down in Roman numeral 3c. Ramesses and Pithom were constructed in the days of Sesostris III for the purpose of storing extra food and supplies for the soldiers manning the eastern fortifications, which defended against attack from the east. They were built in the 12th dynasty. They were built to hold food, to hold weapons, clothing, other kinds of things that soldiers would need who were manning fortifications. You think, oh, they had 2 forts there, no more. I just put those there just to represent the fact they had a line of fortresses coming along here to protect them from the enemy. Sesostris III was doing all these things. And he had slave labor from this area build these cities as store cities to store food, not to store grain because the famine was coming, but to store supplies for the fortresses that were on his eastern border. These sites were later destroyed by the Hyksos when they invaded Egypt. The 16th dynasty was totally a Hyksos domination of Egypt. Now we're studying the 12th dynasty. There's the 13th, 14th, 15th. The 16th dynasty was when the Hyksos took over. They built their capital, Avaris, right over the ruins of ancient Ramesses, the store city. That was built in the 12th dynasty. Now in the 16th dynasty, they built the Hyksos capital of Avaris in that place. After Avaris was destroyed, Ramesses II then built his capital city right over the very same spot. So man, it's just a pile of old sites that are there. They just built one on top of another. And so they have to excavate pretty deep to get down to find the stuff that was there in the 12th dynasty, but they have. Okay, so let's look at another thing that we find about Sesostris III. Sesostris III used slave labor to construct the store cities of Ramesses and Python. Now, there had not been slave labor in that area for 100 years more. It just was free workers, both Egyptians and foreigners alike. But the general of Sesostris III, whose name was Mentu and Hot, that's exactly how that is. Mentu and Hot, the general of Sesostris III, he makes this claim on his stela. Now, a stela is something that you have in your tomb that has all your brag sheet, it tells about things that you accomplished and you did. And so this general of Sesostris III, he claims that he was appreciated by the king for mastering the insurgents of Asia, the rebels of the northern territories. So, if you really believe, if you come to believe that what we're reading in Egyptian history is what was happening in the biblical story as well, then all of a sudden it's weird that you have a name. You actually have a name of the general that was in control of enslaving and making taskmasters. It just says in the Bible that they put taskmasters over the Israelites. But all of a sudden in Egyptian history you find who it was that went in there and massacred the insurgents of Asia, the rebels of the northern territory. The Cambridge Ancient History records that camps of Asiatics under the direction of Egyptian officials existed not far from the royal residence. And this was written by Posner in the Cambridge Ancient History. And he also says that these camps of foreign slaves appeared during the 12th dynasty. And they were not far from the royal residences that were in that very area. William Simpson, in A History of the Ancient Near East, quotes from various papyri during the reign of Sesostris III that describe deliveries and inspections, the expenditure of labor on building projects, and lists of men arranged by work gangs. So we read in the Bible that taskmasters came in and made slaves of the Israelites, and they put them to work making bricks and building these cities. And then we find in Egyptian history that there were slaves that had been made of the people who lived in that area. And then we find all of these inscriptions about deliveries and inspections and expenditures of labor and lists of men arranged in work gangs that were going on at that time. Now, if you were to find just any one thing, just any one of the things that we have talked about in the class so far, you might go, well, so what? There was always lists of inspections and expenditures and work assignment. I mean, there would have always been that. But when you combine it with everything else, then it doesn't discredit what the Bible says. It doesn't say something that would be different than what the Bible says was going on there. It's just like, yeah, the Bible says this is what was going on there, and that is what was going on there at that time. Now, William Hayes talks about the construction techniques by the pharaohs of ancient history. It says, the pyramids of the kings of the 12th dynasty at El Lisht. You go, well, that doesn't mean anything to me. El Lisht is the place where the pyramid of Sesostris I was built also Amenemhet the first. Their pyramids were at El Lish. And also just north of the pyramid of Sesostris was this huge tomb of an unnamed official who served under Amenemhet the first, Sesostris the first, Amenemhet the second, and Sesostris the second. You'll love to try saying that stuff. I really think I did pretty well considering. I don't see any upright. But so it talks about the pyramids of the kings of the 12th dynasty of El Lisht at Dashur, El Lahun, and Hawara followed the old kingdom. There was the old kingdom where those massive pyramids at Cheops and all those places are found. And then we're studying the 12th dynasty, which is in the Middle Kingdom. Okay? So it says that the pyramids that they built were, they followed the old kingdom type, but they were smaller and they were of inferior construction. All were cased with limestone. That is to say, they had a mixture of limestone cement, mortar, that they put on over what it was actually made of, just to make it look good, make it look sturdy. So they were cased with limestone, but only the pyramid of Amenemhet the first was built entirely of stone, throughout of stone. The others being either of rubble-filled cellular construction or of mud brick. So in the previous dynasties, they built all their stuff out of stones, entirely. All of a sudden in the 12th dynasty, you start seeing this construction of mud bricks. All right, let's look. Let's just put it up here. Exodus chapter 5, verses 7 and 8. And this is in the days of Moses, which is another 80 to 100 years later after what we're studying right now. The people are wanting to leave. Moses is demanding that Pharaoh let the people go. And so Pharaoh says, you tell those people you're no longer, or tell the taskmasters, you're no longer to give the people straw to make brick as previously. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. But the quota of bricks which they were making previously, you shall impose on them. You're not to reduce any of it, because they're lazy. Therefore they cry out, let us go and sacrifice to our God. So here they are. Now the people had cried out to God in the Bible, and God spoke to Moses at the burning bush, and he said, I have heard the cry of my people. They've been enslaved for a long time. I don't believe that at the time of Moses that they'd been enslaved for 400 years, as we often had thought in the past. But I think they had been enslaved for 100 years, maybe. That's still a pretty long time. You know, that gives some people time to be born, learn to be a mud tromper and a brickmaker, and live your entire life doing nothing but that, and then die. That's the only life you ever knew, was making bricks, and the next generation continues on doing the same thing. And we find that in the 12th dynasty, there was a transition from making things of stone to making things with mud bricks. I probably should have dug out one of the pictures and put it on here. But the note says that pictures of broken bricks from the sites constructed by Sesostris III were clearly made of mud laced with straw. So I saw a picture. I saw the pictures. I just was too lazy to put them in for your sake. And you'll probably be too lazy to go look them up yourselves where you can see those pictures. But there are, guys holding these bricks that came from the construction in the time of Sesostris III. They're broken open, little strands of straw, kind of sticking out where they were held together with that. So all of this stuff all of it fits. Now, let's go back to Exodus chapter 1 again. Exodus 1, verse 8. Now, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and in the event of war they also join themselves to those who hate us, and fight against us, and depart from the land. So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor, and they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramesses. So what do you see described in this biblical story? Now you're messing with me again, Troy. I saw your little arrow down there. Oh, what do we see? This is what we see in the biblical story. A paranoid Pharaoh. We see that in Sesostris III. We see the enslavement of the foreigners in the land of Jordan. See that at the time of Sesostris. Asiatics mastered in the northern territory. Construction using bricks of mud and straw to build the storage cities that are even named in the Bible. So all of these points here are evident in the reign of Sesostris III, and it continues on. The slave labor wasn't just here. It continued on to the reign of Amenemhet III and on to the end of the reign of Amenemhet IV. And it just spirals downhill to the disastrous conclusion of the 12th dynasty. If you've read your Bible, you know what it is. But we'll see what history records about the end of the 12th dynasty under Amenemhet IV. In fact, there still remains no detail of the story of Joseph and the Israelites in the land of Canaan that is just an obvious contradiction to what was happening in Egyptian history. They don't contradict one another. They go side by side, and these are all things that we looked at all the way down to this point. So we begin to wonder now. We say, well, all right, we got the slaves, and they're building these storage cities, and they're under harsh, cruel labor. And so what about Moses? Moses comes to the rescue. God sends Moses. Do we see any evidence of that in the 12th dynasty of Egyptian history? Well, we'll see that next week. Next week we'll look to see what we find about the Moses and what happens to this time. That'll be lesson 7. And then we'll have lesson 8 and lesson 9. 3 more lessons in this series. And next week is Moses coming on the scene. Okay.